She had crossed 900 miles of America to marry a man she had never seen. He took one look at her on the platform, called her a half-starved church mouse, and threw a nickel into the snow at her feet. Then he turned his back and walked away. The train pulled out behind her. The temperature was already falling, and the entire town of Silver Creek had been ordered to let her freeze. But 18 miles to the west on a mountain she did not know existed, three brothers were already saddling their horses. And this is the story of what happened when they rode into town that night. The iron wheels of the westbound train shrieked against the frozen rails of Silver Creek Station, and the sound carried across the empty Montana Valley like the cry of a wounded animal. Steam rose in thick white clouds from beneath the locomotive, hung for a moment in the dead December air, then drifted away on a wind that came down from the Bitterroot Mountains, carrying the smell of pine and snow and old stone. The date was December the 14th, 1883. The hour was just past 4 in the afternoon. The sun had already begun its slow surrender behind the western peaks, and the light that remained had turned the color of weak tea, thin and golden, and somehow sorrowful, the way light gets when it knows it has only minutes left. Ruth Ellery stepped down from the third-class carriage with both hands clutching the worn carpet bag that held everything she owned in this world. Her boots, thin city boots made of cheap leather and never meant for a Montana winter, struck the wooden planks of the platform with a hollow sound. She wore a navy blue traveling dress that had once been her finest possession, and over it a wool shawl that was already too thin for the cold pressing against her shoulders. Her honey-colored hair was pinned up in the modest fashion of a respectable young woman from St. Louis, though strands of it had escaped during the long ride and now hung against her cheeks. She was 22 years old. She was alone, and she had crossed 900 miles of America to meet a man she had never seen. In her gloved right hand, beneath the handle of the carpet bag, she held the letter. It had been folded and unfolded so many times during the 9 days of her journey that the paper had grown soft as cloth at the creases. She did not need to read it again. She had memorized every word. A respectable young woman is sought for matrimony. Doctrinal woman of good character. Christian household. Established businessman. Silver Creek, Montana territory. Reply to H. Blackwell, care of Silver Creek Trust. She had read those words by candlelight in a boarding house in St. Louis after she had nowhere left to go. She had written her reply with hands that still trembled from hunger. And the answer that came back 2 weeks later in a heavy masculine script that promised security and dignity in a Christian home had felt to her like a door opening in a wall that had been closing around her for years. Now she stood on the platform and looked for the man who had written that letter. There were perhaps a dozen people scattered along the wooden boardwalk, all of them wrapped in heavy furs and woolen coats, and every one of them turned to stare at her. The kind of stare that is not curiosity, but appraisal. The kind that weighs and measures and finds wanting. A man stepped forward from the doorway of the depot. He was perhaps 50 years old, broad in the middle, dressed in a black wool coat with a fur collar, and a tall city hat that did not belong on a Montana platform. Two younger men stood at his shoulders, both with the slack faces and watchful eyes of men paid to be useful in unpleasant ways. The older man approached Ruth slowly, and she saw his eyes travel down her body and back up to her face, and she saw his expression change from expectation to something colder. "You are the Ellery girl," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, sir. I am Ruth. Are you Mr. Blackwell?" He did not answer at first. He continued to look at her, and his mouth pulled itself into a shape that was not quite a smile and not quite a sneer. Then he turned his head and spat a stream of brown tobacco juice onto the snow beside the platform. "The broker promised me a lady," he said, "a woman of some means. The letter said you came from a respectable Boston family." She felt the cold open up inside her chest. "I never said Boston, sir. I said St. Louis, and I never claimed means. I told the truth. I am a governess. I have my education and my Bible and my willingness to work." Blackwell laughed. It was a small, ugly laugh, the kind a man makes when he wants the other men nearby to know he is not impressed. The two thugs at his shoulders chuckled along with him. I paid $40 to that broker for a wife, he said. Not for some half-starved church mouse in a dress that has seen better seasons. I am a man of standing in this town, girl. I cannot have you on my arm. You would shame me before every banker and rancher in the Bitterroot Valley. Find your own way home. He reached into his vest pocket and drew out a single coin, a nickel, 5 cents. He flipped it through the air, and it landed in the snow at Ruth's feet, and then Horace Blackwell turned his back on her and walked away across the platform with his two men following behind. She did not move. She could not move. The wind came down from the mountains and pressed against her, and the cold of the platform began to seep up through the thin soles of her boots. She heard the conductor's whistle. She heard the chuff and grind of the locomotive as it began to pull away from the station. She watched her train the train she had come on, the train that held the only familiar thing in her life, slide past her and gather speed and disappear around the curve of the tracks. Then there was only the sound of the wind and the sound of her own breathing. Listen to me now, friend, because I want you to understand something. A grown woman in a wet wool dress with no coat and no fire and no shelter in a Montana valley in mid-December at 4 in the afternoon has perhaps 90 minutes before her body begins to fail her. 90 minutes between the moment the train pulled away and the moment Ruth Ellery would lie down in the snow and not get up again. And what makes this story the kind of story I tell at this lonely hour, the kind of story I think is worth your time, is what happened during those 90 minutes. Because the entire town of Silver Creek had already decided what they would do about Ruth Ellery. They had decided to do nothing. And on a mountain 18 miles to the west, three brothers who had never seen her face had been given a different kind of decision to make. Before we go any further into this story tonight, friend, if you find yourself drawn to tales of the old frontier, the kind your father or your grandfather might have told, beside a fire when the snow was deep and the night was long, then take a moment to subscribe. I share a new story every week. And while you are at it, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. I read every one. Ruth bent down slowly. Her fingers were already stiff inside the thin gloves. She picked up the nickel from the snow because she did not have the pride yet to leave it there. Then she straightened up and she looked around her at the town of Silver Creek. And for the first time since she had stepped off that train, she allowed herself to understand that she was going to have to ask strangers for help. She had been born to ask no one for anything. Her father, Samuel Ellery, had been a cobbler in St. Louis, a quiet, honest man who made shoes the old way and refused to make them any other way. Her mother, Prudence, had taught at the small school behind the Methodist Church on Olive Street. The two of them had given Ruth an education far above their station. By the age of 10, she could read Latin. By 12, she had finished all the plays of Shakespeare in a battered single volume that her mother had bought secondhand for 30 cents. They had given her also the deeper thing, the thing that lasts longer than Latin, which her mother had spoken of often. Dignity is not something the world gives you, child. Dignity is something you build inside yourself, brick by brick, and the world cannot take it from you, no matter how hard it tries. In the summer of 1874, when Ruth was 13 years old, the cholera came to St. Louis. It came up out of the river in the heat of August, and it took both her parents within 5 days of each other. She had nursed them. She had held the cool cloths to their fevered foreheads, and she had whispered the 23rd Psalm into their ears as their breathing grew slower and finally stopped, and she had buried them in the small Methodist cemetery on a Tuesday morning with no money for headstones. After that, the church had placed her with the Whitcomb family. The Whitcombs were merchants. They lived in a tall house in the Lafayette Square district, and they needed a girl to mind their two young children and to teach them their letters and their sums. For 9 years, Ruth had served in that house. She had taught the children well. She had risen at 5 in the morning and gone to bed at 11 at night, and she had read borrowed books by candlelight in the hours she could steal from sleep. She had played the piano for Mrs. Whitcomb in the evenings, and she had been content. Not happy, perhaps, but content because she had a roof and food and the small private kingdom of her own mind to retreat to. And then in October of 1883, Mr. Whitcomb had come home from his club very late and very drunk, and he had found his way to the small attic room where the governess slept. Ruth had pushed him away. She had cried out. The crash of his drunken body falling against the hallway table had brought Mrs. Whitcomb running, and Mrs. Whitcomb had stood in the gaslight at the top of the stairs and looked at the scene in the hallway and chosen the easier story, the story in which the governess had tempted the husband. By morning, Ruth had been standing on the front steps with her carpet bag, no last month's wages in her hand, no letter of reference, no place in the world. She had slept 3 nights in the back pew of Second Baptist Church. She had eaten what the church ladies left out for the poor. And on the 4th day in the city paper that someone had abandoned on a bench in the park, she had seen the advertisement from H. Blackwell of Silver Creek, Montana Territory. The broker, an elderly woman named Margaret Crandall, who kept a small office above a tobacconist's shop on Pine Street, had been kind to her. She had asked very few questions. She had charged Ruth almost nothing. And 2 weeks later, the answer had come back from Mr. Blackwell. Accepted. Send fare and trousseau money to be reimbursed upon arrival. Ruth had sold her mother's wedding ring, the only thing she had left in the world that had touched her mother's hand, and she had bought a one-way ticket on the Missouri Pacific Railroad. For 9 days she had ridden west, sleeping, sitting up in the third-class carriage, eating bread and cold sausage from a paper bag, praying every night that the man waiting at the other end of the tracks would be a kind man. He had not been a kind man. She crossed the platform now, and she walked into the town of Silver Creek with her chin held as high as she could hold it. Her boots were already soaked through. Her toes had begun the slow journey from cold to numb. The first snowflakes of what would become a serious storm were drifting down out of the gray sky and catching in her hair. The Methodist Church stood at the corner of Main Street and Bitterroot Avenue. It was a small white building with a steeple that needed paint. Ruth climbed the 3 wooden steps and knocked on the heavy oak door. She heard footsteps inside. The door opened a hand's breadth, and the long, unfriendly face of the Reverend Whitaker looked out at her. "I am sorry to trouble you, sir," she said. "My name is Ruth Ellery. I have come to Silver Creek to be married, and the gentleman who wrote for me has refused me. I have no place to sleep tonight. I am asking only for a corner of your church and a cup of warm water." The Reverend Whitaker looked at her for a long moment, and Ruth saw something move in his eyes that she would later recognize as shame fighting against fear. Fear won. "We do not house unmarried women of doubtful character in this church," he said. "You should return to where you came from." He closed the door before she could speak again. She stood on the steps for almost a full minute. Then she turned and went back down to the street. The Pritchard house was the only boarding house in Silver Creek. It stood on 2nd Street beside the livery, and it was painted yellow, and there were lace curtains in the front windows. Ruth knocked on that door too, and it was opened by a heavy-set woman in a flour-stained apron, a woman with kind, tired eyes and the broken capillaries of someone who had lived a hard life. Mrs. Pritchard listened to Ruth's request without interrupting. When Ruth had finished, the woman in the apron looked over her shoulder back into the warm hallway of her boarding house. Then she looked back at Ruth, and Ruth saw the same shame in her face that she had seen in the preacher's, and the same fear. "I am sorry, child, I truly am. But Mr. Blackwell sent his man around an hour ago. He told every shopkeeper and every innkeeper and every stable owner in Silver Creek that any house which takes you in will lose his business, and his business is half the income of this town. He owns the bank. He holds the notes on most of the homes you see from this porch. I have 3 children, child. I cannot help you. May God forgive me." The door of the Pritchard house closed gently. Ruth heard the bolt slide. She tried the bakery on Main Street, where the warm smell of bread coming through the doorway nearly broke her resolve. The baker would not even open the door. She tried the general store. The owner came to the window, looked at her, and shook his head and turned his back. She tried the livery stable, thinking she might be allowed to sleep in the hay with the horses. The old man who ran the stable came out of his office with his hat in his hand and tears in his eyes, and he told her he could not. He could not. His wife was sick, and he could not lose Blackwell's business, and please God forgive him. She walked back toward the platform with the wind cutting through her shawl and the snow beginning to fall in earnest now. The light was going. Lamps were beginning to glow yellow in the windows of the house as she passed. Behind those windows, families were sitting down to suppers of beef stew and cornbread and hot coffee, and Ruth could smell those suppers as she walked by. She had reached the wooden steps of the Henderson Bakery on Main Street, the same bakery that had refused to open its door to her when she sat down on the bottom step because she did not think her legs would carry her any farther. She put her face in her gloved hands. She did not weep. She had not wept since the day she buried her parents 9 years before. Weeping was a luxury she had taught herself not to afford, but she did close her eyes for a moment, and she did say in her heart, "Lord, if you are there, if you ever love me, take me quickly. Do not let me freeze for hours." A small hand touched her sleeve. She opened her eyes. A child stood in front of her on the boardwalk, a girl perhaps 8 years old, dressed in a faded brown coat too large for her and a knitted cap pulled down over her ears. The child had freckles across the bridge of her nose, and she had clear gray eyes, and in her small, mittened hand she was holding a thick slice of brown bread that was still warm from the oven. And she pushed it toward Ruth. "Take it," the child whispered. "My pa is the blacksmith. He saw what happened at the train. He says I am to give you this and I am to tell you something. He says you have to listen close because we cannot stop and we cannot be seen." Ruth took the bread. Her hand was shaking so badly she almost dropped it. "What is your name, sweetheart?" "Lily Hanson." The child glanced over her shoulder, then back at Ruth. "Listen, miss, go west out of town toward the big mountain you can see at the end of Main Street. The one with the snow on top. 18 miles up the trail, there is a cabin. 3 brothers live there. Their name is Holloway. They do not come into town very often, but they came this morning. My pa saw them at the feed store. My pa says they are the last good men in this whole valley. He says they are not afraid of Mr. Blackwell. He says if anyone in Montana will help you, it is them. The road leaves town past the schoolhouse. Follow the wagon ruts." Lily, a woman's voice, called sharply from somewhere down the street. "Lily Hanson, where are you?" The child looked once more into Ruth's face with an expression too old for her years, and then she squeezed Ruth's wrist and turned and ran. A moment later, Ruth saw a woman in a gray shawl catch the child by the hand and pull her quickly around the corner of the dry goods store. The woman did not look back, but Ruth saw her shoulders and she understood that the woman was crying. Ruth ate the bread slowly. She ate it sitting on the bakery steps with the snow falling on her shoulders, and it was the best bread she had ever tasted in her life. When it was waved, she licked the crumbs from her glove. Then she stood up and she looked west down Main Street toward the great white shoulder of the mountain that closed the horizon at the end of the town. 18 miles. In her boots and her dress, in this snow, she would not make a single mile before nightfall. She knew that. But the child had come. The child had come, and the child had spoken the words that her mother might have spoken, and Ruth Ellery understood then that she was being asked to make a choice. To die on the steps of this town, or to die walking toward those mountains. She chose the mountains. She did not get far. She made it past the schoolhouse and out onto the open road. She walked for perhaps a quarter of a mile with the wind getting harder against her face and the snow getting deeper underfoot. And then her right boot, the one whose sole had been failing all morning, finally split open along the seam. The cold rushed up into her foot like ice water, and within 50 more steps, she could no longer feel her toes. She stumbled. She fell forward onto her hands and knees. She got up. She stumbled again. She crawled the last 20 feet back to the wooden platform of the train station and pulled herself up against the wall of the depot in the only sheltered corner she could find, and she sat down with her back against the rough boards and her knees pulled up against her chest. She opened her carpet bag, fumbling with stiff fingers, and she took out the only 2 things that mattered to her. Her mother's small leather Bible and her grandmother's cameo brooch on its silver chain. She held the Bible against her heart with one hand and the brooch against her lips with the other, and she began to whisper the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. The light went out of the sky. The lamps came on in the windows of the houses across the street, and Ruth Ellery prepared herself with what dignity she could still gather to die. 18 miles to the west on the long trail that comes down the eastern slope of the Bitterroot Range, three men were riding towards Silver Creek. The man in the lead rode a big black gelding called Brutus. His name was Elias Holloway, and he was 34 years old, and he was the eldest of the three brothers who held the deed to 800 acres of mountain pasture and timberland that their father had claimed in the year 1856. He was very tall, 6'5" in his stockings, and he was built in the long, lean way that mountain work builds a man all sinew and weather. His hair was the color of a chestnut shell, and it was too long, and it was tied back behind his neck with a strip of leather. His eyes were the color of dark amber, almost golden in certain light, and they were not friendly eyes. They were the eyes of a man who has watched too many things and learned to keep his own counsel about them. He wore a heavy bearskin coat that had belonged to his father. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the weather. On the saddle in front of him, in a leather scabbard, lay a Sharps 50 caliber rifle that could drop an elk at 600 yards. He had not spoken a word in the last half hour. The second man rode a chestnut mare named Cinder. He was the same age as his brother Elias because the two of them had been born twins on a stormy April night in 1849, with 12 minutes between them. His name was Silas Holloway. He was an inch shorter than Elias and a little broader through the shoulders, and his hair was the color of dark wheat, and his eyes were the warm brown of good whiskey. He had the kind of face that smiled easily, though the smile never quite reached the part of him that had ridden into Virginia in the spring of 1865 at the age of 16 and seen what he had seen there. Silas wore a long gray duster coat, and beneath it the faded blue tunic of a Union cavalryman, the same tunic he had been wearing the day Robert E. Lee had ridden up to the Appomattox Courthouse and surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia. He still wore that tunic for cold weather work. He said it was the warmest thing he owned. His brothers knew it was something more than that. As they rode, Silas was singing. He had a fine baritone voice, low and unhurried, and the song he was singing was Shenandoah, the way his mother had sung it over the washtub on summer mornings when he was a boy. Oh, Shenandoah, I long to hear you. Away, you rolling river. Oh, Shenandoah, I long to hear you. Away, I'm bound away across the wide Missouri. The third rider was Amos Holloway. He was 28 years old, the youngest of the three brothers, and he rode a steady old roan named Pilgrim. Amos was 6'3", slimmer than his brothers, with sandy hair that would turn nearly white in the summer sun, and with the bright amber eyes that were the mark of his father's blood. Behind his horse on a long lead came a heavy wooden sledge that was piled high with cured deer hides and two carefully folded bearskins. 18 weeks of winter trapping ready to trade for the season's salt and sugar and coffee and ammunition. Amos was the gentlest of the three brothers. He carved birds out of pine wood by firelight in the long evenings. He played his father's old fiddle on Sunday mornings, the slow hymns his mother had loved. He was the only one of the three who still said grace before meals. As they came down through the last stand of lodgepole pine before the trail opened onto the wagon road, Silas finished his song and Elias spoke for the first time in almost an hour. "We need to talk about the North Pasture," he said. He did not turn his head when he spoke. His voice was low and even, the voice of a man who never wasted breath. Silas sighed. "We have talked about the North Pasture every day for 2 months, brother. The answer is the same. Sell the pasture, save the herd. Sell the herd, lose the pasture. We cannot pay Blackwell from grass that does not feed cows." "We are not selling the pasture," Elias said. "Father bled into that ground in 1874. We are not giving it to the man who put the bullet in him." "I know what Father did," Silas said quietly. "I dug the grave myself. Then we are not selling." Amos rode behind them in silence for a moment, watching the great white peaks of the Bitterroots catch the last of the afternoon sun. Then he spoke, and his voice was soft. Mother used to say when things look the worst that the Lord sends what we need on the day we need it, not the day before and not the day after. She said we just have to be ready to recognize it when it comes. Elias half turned in the saddle and looked back at his younger brother. He did not say anything, but the line of his mouth softened a little. Then he looked forward again, and he touched Brutus with his heels, and the three brothers rode the last mile down out of the timber and into the town of Silver Creek. They came in past the schoolhouse on the western edge of town. They saw almost immediately that something was wrong. Main Street was empty. At 5 o'clock on a December afternoon with the snow coming on the street should have been busy with men finishing their last business of the day. Instead, the boardwalks were deserted. The few men they did see were standing in shop doorways, talking quietly, glancing toward the train depot at the eastern end of the street, and then looking quickly away. The Holloway brothers had ridden into Silver Creek every 6 weeks for 9 years, and they knew the look of a town that was talking about something. They angled their horses toward the Red Garter Saloon, which stood across the street from the bank because the Red Garters was where you went in Silver Creek to find out what a town was talking about. They tied their horses at the rail. Elias slid the sharps out of its scabbard and set it casually across the crook of his arm, the way a man carries a rifle who is not expecting trouble, but is not opposed to it either. The three brothers walked through the swinging doors and into the warm, tobacco-smelling gloom of the saloon. The conversation inside dropped by half when they came in. Then it picked back up a little louder than before, with the false hardiness men use when they have been caught talking about something they would rather a stranger not hear. The brothers walked to the bar. The bartender, a man named Mike who had known their father, set down 3 glasses without being asked and poured an inch of whiskey into each. Elias laid a coin on the polished wood. Mike pushed it back. "On the house tonight, gentlemen?" Elias raised one eyebrow but said nothing. They drank the whiskey slowly, listening. At a table near the stove, 4 men were playing cards. One of them was a thin, sour-faced cowhand named Curtis, a man known in the valley for his loud opinions and his smaller honor. He had been drinking since noon, and the whiskey was speaking through him now, and he was telling a story to the men at his table in a voice loud enough for half the saloon to hear. "You boys would not believe it," Curtis was saying. "Old Blackwell sent away to St. Louis for a wife. Through one of those mail catalogs, paid $40, cash money for her. The girl gets off the train this afternoon, and Blackwell takes one look at her and says no thank you. Says she is not what he ordered. Throws her down on the platform with a nickel for her supper and tells her to find her own way home. He laughed, and the men at his table laughed with him. The girl is still sitting out there on the platform, last I heard. No coat, no decent shoes, no place to go. I got $5, says she stiffens up before midnight. Any man here want to take that bet?" Silas Holloway set his whiskey glass down on the bar very slowly and very carefully. Then he stood up from the bar and turned toward the table. Elias's hand caught his arm. "Not here," Elias said. His voice was quiet. He did not look at his brother. He was looking at the front window of the saloon, at the snow blowing past it sideways, at the gray light of the dying afternoon. Then he turned his head and looked at Amos. "Go on out," he said. "Walk to the depot. Walk slow. Do not run. Do not let anyone notice. If she is there, see if she is still alive. Come back and tell me." Amos was already moving. He set his glass down, nodded once to his brothers, and walked out of the Red Garter without hurrying. The swinging doors creaked behind him. Silas and Elias stood at the bar and waited. 5 minutes passed. 6. Curtis at the card table had moved on to a different story, something about a horse he had broken last spring, and the laughter at his table was looser now and easier. Then the swinging doors opened again, and Amos came back in, and his face was the color of bone china. He walked straight to his brothers, and he leaned in close, and he spoke so softly that only the 2 of them could hear. "She is alive, brother. Lord help us. She is alive, but not for long. Maybe an hour, maybe less. She is sitting up against the depot wall, and her lips are blue, and she is holding a Bible against her chest. Her boots are gone, one of them anyway, and her foot is the color of a plum. Elias turned away from the bar in one slow movement. He set his empty whiskey glass down with deliberate care. He did not look at the table where Curtis was sitting. He walked to the door of the saloon, and Silas walked beside him, and Amos walked a half step behind. Just as Elias laid his hand on the swinging door, Curtis's voice came across the room one more time, a little louder than necessary. "You boys not gonna play hero, are you?" Old Blackwell would not like that. Old Blackwell would not like that one bit. Elias stopped. He did not turn his head all the way around. He turned it just far enough that the hard amber light of his eyes could fall on Curtis across the smoke of the saloon. He did not say a word. He did not need to. The laughter at Curtis's table died as if a hand had been laid across the throat of every man at it. Curtis went pale and looked down at his cards. Elias turned back to the door, and the three Holloway brothers walked out into the snow. The platform of Silver Creek Station was almost dark by the time they reached it. The lamps had not yet been lit. The wind was stronger, now blowing the snow sideways down the length of the boardwalk. At the far end, against the depot wall in a corner where the eaves cut some of the wind, there was a small, huddled shape that did not move when the brothers approached. The shape was the color of the dead grass and the gray boards behind it. It was almost invisible against them. Amos got to her first. He went to one knee on the snowy boards beside her, and he pulled off his right glove with his teeth, and he laid his bare hand against her cheek. The cheek was as cold as Riverstone, but he could feel just barely the soft, small pulse beating beneath the skin under her ear. "She is here," he said. His voice cracked. "Lord God, Elias, she is still here, but she is leaving us. She is leaving us right now." Elias was already moving. He set the Sharps rifle down on the planks beside Amos, and his hands went to the buttons of his bearskin coat, the great heavy coat that had belonged to Thomas Holloway, and that was the warmest piece of clothing in the entire Bitterroot Valley. He pulled the coat off his own shoulders. He bent down. With a tenderness that was strange to see in such a large man, he wrapped the bearskin around the small body of the woman against the wall, tucked it under her arms, drew it close against her throat. Silas had already pulled the heavy wool muffler from his own neck and was kneeling at her feet, wrapping it around the bare blue foot where the broken boot had fallen away in the snow. Amos took his own scarf and wrapped it around the other foot. Then Elias slid his arms beneath her, one arm under her knees and one arm beneath her shoulders, and he lifted her up off the platform as easily as a man lifts a child. She weighed almost nothing inside the great bearskin coat. She weighed less than a sack of feed grain. Her head fell against his chest. Her dark blonde hair brushed the stubble of his jaw, and Elias Holloway, who had not held a woman in his arms since the day his mother died 9 years ago, felt something break loose inside him that he had thought was dead and buried with her. Her eyes opened, just for a moment. She looked up into the dark beard and the harsh, weathered face above her, and her lips moved, and she whispered 4 words. "Are you angels, sir?" Then her eyes closed and her head fell back against him, and she was gone again into the place between sleeping and not waking up. A door slammed open across the street. Light spilled out onto the snow. The heavy figure of Horace Blackwell came down the steps of the Silver Creek Trust Bank with 3 men behind him. The sheriff of Silver Creek, a long, lean man named Briggs, whose star did not mean what it should have meant, was one of the 3. The other 2 were men Elias did not recognize. Hired guns by the look of them. Blackwell was shouting before he had even crossed the street. "Holloway, you put that woman down. You put her down right now. She is mine. I paid $40 to the broker for her, and that makes her my legal property in this territory. Briggs, arrest him. Arrest all 3 of them." Sheriff Briggs took 1 step forward and then no more. Elias Holloway turned slowly with the woman still cradled against his chest. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His voice when he spoke was the low rolling thunder that comes down out of the high passes before a storm. "Mr. Blackwell, you threw this woman down on a public platform in the cold. You ordered the people of this town not to give her shelter. By the law of God and by the law of any decent man, you have given her up. You have no claim on her. You never had a claim on her. If she lives the night she lives, because we picked her up where you left her to die, and if you take one more step toward me, Mr. Blackwell, I am going to set her down very gently in my brother's arms, and then I am going to walk across the street, and I am going to settle a debt with you that has been owed in this valley for 9 years. Silas Holloway had a Colt pistol drawn and held loose at his side, the muzzle pointed at the wooden boards. Amos was already moving, gathering the hides off the sledge and lashing them swiftly to the saddles, making the horses ready. Sheriff Briggs looked at Elias's face, and he looked at Silas's pistol, and he looked at the dying woman in the bearskin coat, and he made the only intelligent decision of his life. He took one step backward and then another, and his hand came away from the butt of his own gun. Blackwell saw the sheriff retreat. His face turned the color of old lever. He pointed a fat finger at Elias. You will pay for this, Holloway. You and that little church mouse both. She will not be welcome in this town again. Neither will you. I will have your land. I will have everything you own before the year is out. Mark me on it. Elias looked at him for a long moment over the head of the unconscious woman in his arms. So be it, he said. He turned his back on Horace Blackwell. He carried Ruth Ellery to the chestnut mare Cinder. Amos took her from his brother's arms with the same care a father takes a newborn from a midwife, and he settled her against his chest in the saddle, and Silas swung up behind to make sure she did not fall. Elias mounted Brutus. He sheathed the sharps. He looked once more toward the bank where Blackwell still stood in the lamplight with his 3 men around him. Then he touched his heels to the black gelding's flanks, and then the 3 Holloway brothers rode out of the town of Silver Creek with the woman cradled between them, and the snow closed behind them like a curtain falling, and not one soul on the boardwalks of Silver Creek dared to call after them. The trail to the cabin climbed 18 hard miles into the Bitterroot Range, and it climbed in the teeth of a storm that was now blowing in earnest off the high country. The wind came from the northwest at 30 miles an hour, and the snow with it was the small, hard kind that stings the face like sand. Within a quarter mile of leaving town, the brothers could no longer see the lights of Silver Creek behind them. Within a half mile, they could see nothing at all but the few feet of trail directly in front of their horses. Elias rode in the lead. He rode without hurry and without hesitation, and any man watching him would have understood that this was a man who had ridden this trail in worse weather than this and would ride it again. He read the country by the slope of the ground beneath his horse's hooves, by the change in the smell of the air when they passed under the heavy boughs of pine, by some older, quieter knowledge that the old mountain men had, and almost no one else did. Silas rode in the rear, twisted half around in his saddle every few minutes to look back along the trail, the Colt now tucked into the front of his coat where it would be warm enough to fire. He did not believe Blackwell would send men after them tonight in this weather. But Silas Holloway had ridden into Virginia at 16, and Silas Holloway did not believe what he wanted to believe anymore. He believed only what he could see. In the middle of the small column on the chestnut mare, Cinder Amos held Ruth against his chest, with both arms wrapped around her inside the bearskin coat. Every few minutes he would lower his head and press his ear against the place where her heart was beating, beneath the coat, and he would count. Sometimes the count was 30 beats in a minute. Sometimes it was 24. Once it was 18, and Amos felt his own heart stop, and he whispered into her hair, "Do not go, please, do not go. We are taking you home." And he counted again, and the count was 22, and he could breathe again. He had never held a woman in his arms before. Not like this. Amos Holloway was 28 years old, and he had lived all his life on a mountain with 2 brothers and the memory of a mother who had died when he was 19, and he had never had occasion to learn what it was to hold another human being so close that you could feel her life trying to leave her body. He found that he was praying without forming the words the way he had heard his mother pray, sometimes when she did not know anyone was listening, just the soft, steady offering up of his whole heart toward the dark sky overhead. Somewhere in the second hour of that ride, in the deepest part of the storm, Ruth opened her eyes one more time. She was past the worst of the cold now. The pain in her feet had gone replaced by a kind of warm dreaming that she half understood was the last warning before death, and she did not care anymore. She lay against the chest of a stranger she had never seen, and she looked up through the swirling snow, and she saw a young man's face above her in the moving lantern light. He had bright amber eyes and a soft mouth, and snow caught in his eyebrows. He looked, she thought, like a painting of a saint she had once seen in a book. Her mother was there in the warm dreaming. Her mother was standing in a field of summer wildflowers in Missouri in a yellow dress Ruth had not seen since she was 6 years old. And her mother was smiling at her, and her mother was saying, "I have been praying for you every night from heaven, my darling. These three are the answer. Trust them. Open your heart. I love you so." And Ruth tried to answer, tried to say, "I love you too, Mama." But her lips would not work, and the dream began to fade, and the last thing she saw before the darkness took her again was the bright amber eyes of the young man above her. And she thought with the small, clear part of her mind that was still her own, "I am not alone anymore. Whatever happens now, I am not alone." They came up out of the timber and onto the bench of land where the cabin stood just before midnight. The storm had not eased. If anything, it had grown worse in the last mile of climbing, and the horses were laboring now through drifts that came up to their knees. Elias swung down from Brutus before the horse had fully stopped. He climbed the three-log steps and unbarred the heavy plank door of the Holloway cabin. The smell of the place came out to meet him. Wood smoke long gone cold, pine pitch in the rafters, bear grease, leather, the faint, clean smell of his mother's lavender soap, which still lived in the cedar chest in the corner of the front room 9 years after her death, the way certain smells will outlive the people who brought them into a house. He stepped inside and held the door wide. "Bring her to the hearth," he said. "Lay her down on the bear rug. Amos, get the fire. Silas, water in the kettle. Not hot, just warm enough to take the bite off. Move now." They moved. There was no wasted motion in any of them. Amos carried Ruth across the threshold and laid her down on the heavy black bear rug that stretched in front of the cold stone hearth. Her head fell to one side. Her eyes did not open. Silas was already moving past them with the iron kettle in one hand and the wooden water bucket in the other. And Elias was kneeling beside the hearth, striking a match against a piece of dry kindling, shaved thin as paper. The fire caught on the first match. It always did when Elias laid it. He had been laying fires in this hearth since he was 7 years old, and his father had taught him then, the same way his father had taught him, which was that a fire is a living thing and must be respected as a living thing, or it will not come when you call it. Within 5 minutes, the great stone hearth that had warmed 3 generations of the Holloway family was warm again, and the orange light of it began to push back the darkness in the front room of the cabin, and the room began to remember what it was to be lived in. Elias turned his attention to the woman on the rug. He had seen frozen feet before. He had seen them on calves and on lambs that had been left out in spring storms, and he had seen them once on a cowhand who had ridden in from the high pasture in the winter of '79 with his hands so badly frozen that 2 of his fingers had come away with the leather of his glove. He knew what to do, and he knew what not to do. The thing not to do was to put the cold flesh near the fire. The thing not to do was to rub the cold flesh hard. The cold flesh had to be brought back the way the cold had taken it, slowly and patiently, with water that was barely warm enough to feel with the gentlest possible touch, with time. "Amos," he said, "your hands are the lightest. You take her feet. Silas, you take her hands. I will see to her face and her throat. We work together. We do not stop until the color comes back. Do you hear me?" His brothers nodded. Amos was already taking off his own coat and rolling up the sleeves of his flannel shirt to the elbows. Silas had set the kettle on the warming shelf at the side of the hearth and was pouring water from it into the wooden basin that he had set on the rug beside Ruth's feet, mixing it with handfuls of fresh snow he had scooped from just outside the doorway testing the temperature against the inside of his own wrist, the way a mother tests milk for a baby. They unwrapped her slowly. The bearskin coat came away first. Beneath it, her navy blue traveling dress was stiff with frost along the hem and the sleeves. The other foot, the one whose boot had failed her on the road, was a darker color, the color of an old plum. The toes were rigid. Elias looked at that foot and felt his jaw set hard because he knew what that foot meant. That foot meant that Ruth Ellery might survive this night and still wake in the morning to find that she had paid for her survival with the loss of one or more of her toes. He did not say this aloud. He simply set himself to the work and prayed silently to the God of his mother that the work would be enough. For more than an hour, the three brothers worked over her in the firelight. Amos held her feet between his hands inside the shallow basin of warm water, and his thumbs moved in slow circles over the soles, and his lips moved in something that was either prayer or song or both. Silas rubbed her hands the same way the long, calloused fingers of a Civil War cavalryman closed gently around the small, white fingers of a woman from St. Louis. Elias laid warm cloths on her throat and her cheeks and the back of her neck, and he changed the cloths every minute as they cooled. The first sign that she was coming back was a small sound from her throat. Then the pain reached her, the pain that comes when the blood begins to find its way back into flesh that has been frozen, and her whole body had arched against the rug, and a thin, sharp cry came out of her, and her eyes flew open. She did not know where she was. Her hands clawed at the air. Silas caught her wrists and held them gently against the rug. "Easy now, miss, easy now. You are safe. You are inside a house. You are by a fire. The pain you are feeling is the pain of coming back. You have to bear it. Look at me, miss. Look at my face." She looked, her blue eyes so wide that they seemed almost black in the firelight, focused with great difficulty on the face above her. Where she whispered, "Where am I?" "You are in the Holloway cabin," said Silas. "We brought you up off the platform at Silver Creek. My name is Silas. The man at your feet is my brother Amos, and the man warming your face is our older brother Elias. You are safe with us, miss. No one in this world is going to touch you here without your saying so. No one." She tried to speak again, and tears came instead. They ran down the sides of her face into her hair, and she made no sound, and Amos at her feet bowed his head over her swollen toes, and his shoulders shook once and then were still. She bore it for a long time. The pain came in waves, and each wave was worse than the one before it. She bit her lower lip until it bled, and she did not cry out again. Toward dawn, she fell into a true sleep. Her breathing deepened. Amos lifted her feet very gently out of the water, dried them with a clean linen cloth, and wrapped them in dry wool. Silas covered her with two of the heavy quilts from the cedar chest, the quilts their mother had made the winter before Amos was born. Elias built up the fire one more time, then sank back onto his heels beside the hearth and looked at his brothers across the sleeping body of the woman they had carried home. "She is gonna live," Amos said softly. "The Lord has let her live." Silas reached out and laid his hand on Amos's shoulder. None of them spoke for a long minute. Then Silas cleared his throat. "Brother," he said to Elias, "when you stood there in the snow at the platform tonight, and you said to that fat banker that she was not his to claim, I want you to know that I heard you. We all three heard you. And whatever you decide to do about it from here, you will not be doing it alone." Elias was looking at the small white face on the bare rug, at the dark blonde hair fanned out against the dark fur, at the bandaged feet showing pale beneath the quilt. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than either of his brothers had heard it in 9 years. "I have not decided anything," he said. "I only know that when I saw her there against that depot wall, I saw a person who was about to die because the world had decided she was not worth saving. And I knew, the way a man knows when he is looking at a sin, that if I rode away from her tonight, I would not be a man anymore. I would be Blackwell." He drew a slow breath. "So we will care for her until she is well enough to walk and talk and think for herself. After that, she chooses whether she stays in this cabin or whether she goes back down the mountain. And I want you both to swear to me now on the souls of our mother and our father that not one of us will speak a word of feeling to her until she is free enough to refuse it. Not one word. No looking, no touching, no claim. We are her brothers in this house until she tells us otherwise. Do you swear it? Amos nodded without lifting his head. I swear it, he whispered. Silas looked at his twin for a long time across the firelight. Then he nodded too. I swear it. On mother, on father, on the cabin they built with their own hands. I swear it. A man keeps his word, Elias said quietly, or he is not a man at all. His brother said it back to him. Outside, the wind that had carried them 18 miles up the mountain finally began to ease, and the first thin gray light of dawn began to show in the small east window of the cabin. The next 5 days passed in the cabin like a single long-held breath. Ruth woke and slept and woke again and could not always tell which was which. The fever came up on the second day and burned through her with hard chills. Sometimes she opened her eyes and saw a man sitting in a chair beside the bed. Sometimes a different man, sometimes the same one. Sometimes the man was reading to her in a soft voice from a Bible, and the words were the 23rd Psalm, and she would close her eyes again and think she had only dreamed her own death and was now in heaven. Amos took the daylight hours. He sat in the wooden chair beside her bed with his Bible open on his knee, and when she was awake, he read to her, and when she slept, he carved small things from soft pine. He told her about a red squirrel that lived in the great pine behind the cabin, whose name, he said, was Pebble, a small brown sparrow that came every morning to the porch railing to eat the breadcrumbs Amos left for him, whose name was Whistler. Silas took the afternoons. Silas was the one who made her laugh. He told her stories of the foolish things he had done as a boy, the time he had tried to ride a young moose in the back pasture and been thrown into a creek for his trouble. He sang for her in the same low baritone he had sung in Coming Down the Mountain. By the third afternoon, Ruth was strong enough to whisper to him that she liked the wordless tune best. And Silas Holloway, who had ridden into Five Forks at 16 years old and seen things no man should see, turned his face away from her so she would not see what her words had done to his eyes. Elias took the nights. He came in after his brothers had gone to their own rooms, and he sat in the chair beside her bed in the dark, and he said almost nothing. He laid the cool cloth on her forehead when the fever rose, and he changed the cloth when it warmed, and he watched her breathe. Once on the third night, he reached out without thinking and brushed a strand of damp hair away from her forehead with the side of his finger. The touch lasted less than a second. He drew his hand back as if it had been burned, and he did not touch her face again for many days. But he did not forget the feeling of it, and he did not sleep at all that night. On the morning of the 6th day, the fever broke. Ruth opened her eyes in the gray dawn light of a strange room and saw a wooden ceiling above her. There was a man asleep in the chair beside her bed. He had fallen asleep with his head bowed forward and his big calloused hands hanging loose between his knees. In his right hand, he was still holding a damp white cloth. His chestnut brown hair had come loose from its leather tie and hung down on either side of his bowed face. She watched the sleeping man for a long, quiet minute. She saw the deep lines weathered into his cheeks by sun and wind and grief. She saw the way his shoulders, even in sleep, were set with the weight of a responsibility he had been carrying for too long alone. And Ruth Ellery, who had not wept since she buried her parents in St. Louis 9 years before, turned her face into the pillow and wept silently because she understood for the first time in her grown life that she had been carried into the house of strangers by men who owed her nothing, and that those men had given everything they had to keep her in this world. The man in the chair stirred, his eyes opened. They were the color of dark amber in the dawn light, and they found her face at once. "You are awake," said Elias Holloway softly. "Yes, sir," said Ruth Ellery. "I believe I am." By the end of the second week, Ruth could sit up in the bed without help. By the end of the third week, she could stand for a few minutes at a time leaning on the cane that Amos had carved for her, a fine, smooth cane of pine wood with a small figure of a dove cut into the top of the handle where her hand would rest. Her toes had survived. All of them. Elias, who had seen so many feet come back from the cold, less whole than this, did not believe it for the first 3 days, and would lift the bandages every morning and look and shake his head in something that was not quite disbelief and not quite gratitude. By the end of the fourth week, she was walking, and by the end of the fourth week, the storms had closed the trail down off the mountain so completely that even Elias would not have tried to ride it. And the four people in the Holloway cabin understood that they were going to be each other's only company until the spring thaw broke the snow. It was during those long shut-in weeks that Ruth Ellery began to make the cabin into something it had not been since the year 1874. It started with a torn shirt. She was sitting up in the front room one morning, wrapped in a quilt in the chair nearest the hearth, and Elias came in from the cold to fetch a fresh coil of rope from the corner. As he turned, she saw that the front of his red flannel work shirt had a long, ragged tear running from the second button down almost to the third. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "may I trouble you for that shirt when you have a minute to change?" Elias stopped in the doorway. "Why," he said, "because if you give me a needle and a length of strong thread, I can mend it for you in 20 minutes, and the shirt will last you another year. And it would be a small thing for me to do that would not be sitting in this chair like a guest." He stood for a moment looking at her. Then he went to his own room and came back wearing a different shirt, and he laid the torn red flannel across her lap without a word. And from the cedar chest in the corner, he took out a small wooden sewing box that had not been opened since his mother's death and set it on the table beside her chair. His mother's box. He did not say whose box it was. He did not need to. Ruth touched the worn lid of the box with the tips of her fingers, and she understood at once, and she looked up at him with such gratitude in her eyes that Elias had to turn away and find something to do in the woodshed for the next hour. When he came back in, the shirt was mended. Not just the tear in the buttons, but every weak place along the seams had been reinforced with small, neat stitches that he could barely see even when he held the cloth up to the lamp. That was the beginning. After the shirt came the floor. After the floor came the windows. After the windows came the cedar chest, in which she found a folded linen tablecloth that had been embroidered along its edges with small blue flowers by a woman she had never met. She lifted that tablecloth out of the chest very carefully, and she pressed it to her cheek, and she said softly into the empty room, "Mrs. Holloway, ma'am, I do not know if you can hear me, but I am going to use this tonight, and I hope you do not mind." After the tablecloth came the bread. She found the flour barrel half full in the small pantry off the kitchen. She found a stoneware crock of dried sourdough starter pushed to the back of the highest shelf, dry as paste, but still alive when she added warm water to it. And on the afternoon of her 40th day in the Holloway cabin, she made the first loaves of bread that had been baked in that kitchen since the spring of 1874. The brothers came home as the sun was going down. They opened the door of their cabin and they stopped one by one in the doorway as if they had walked into the wrong house. The smell hit them first. Warm bread, honey, apples baked with cinnamon. Then they saw the front room. The floor was clean. The hearthstones had been swept. On the long pine table where their father had once sat at the head and their mother at the foot, there was a linen tablecloth. They all three recognized at once, and on the tablecloth there were 4 places set with the good plates from the high cupboard, and in the center of the table there was a brown earthenware jar that Ruth had filled with cuttings of evergreen and a few bright red winterberries. Beside the jar there was a board with 2 round loaves of fresh bread on it, still steaming faintly. Ruth was standing at the stove with her back to them, wearing one of Sarah Holloway's old gray work dresses that Elias had found for her in the cedar chest the week before. She turned around with the wooden spoon still in her hand. "I hope you are hungry," she said. "I am sorry. I should have asked. I just thought." Silas was the first to find his voice. It came out cracked. "9 years," he said. "9 years, ma'am. 9 years this house has not smelled like this." He could not say any more. He stepped past her with his head turned away and went to the basin in the corner. Amos walked to her slowly. He stopped in front of her. He looked down at her, and his amber eyes were full of something that was halfway between worship and grief. He simply reached out and laid the back of his fingers very lightly against her wrist for a moment, and then he too went to the basin. Elias was the last to come into the room. He hung his coat on its peg. He hung his hat above the coat. He walked across his own front room as if he were walking across ground he had never walked across before, and he stopped a few feet from her. "You did not have to do this, Miss Ellery," he said. "You are not a servant in this house. You owe us nothing." "Mr. Holloway," she said, "I am not paying a debt. I am not earning my keep. A debt could be measured and paid. What you and your brothers gave me on a platform in Silver Creek cannot be measured and cannot be paid. I know that. I am not trying to pay it. I am only trying to be the kind of woman in the time I have left in this house who will have been worthy of it. That is all. I have nothing else to give. Please let me give this." He nodded once very slowly. "Sit down with us," he said. "Eat the supper you have made." They sat down at the long pine table for the first time in 9 years, as 4 people instead of 3. Amos said grace. "Lord, we thank thee for this food. We thank thee for the hands that prepared it. We thank thee that thou hast sent us this woman in our hour, and us to her in her hour, and that thou hast made of 2 empty things 1 full thing under this roof. Bless Ruth Ellery, Father. Bless her with as much kindness in the rest of her days as she has shown us in this one. In thy holy name, amen." "Amen," said Silas softly. "Amen," said Elias. "Amen," whispered Ruth, and a tear that she could not stop slid down her cheek and fell onto the linen tablecloth at her place, and she did not try to hide it. The first month in the Holloway cabin became something Ruth could not have named in advance. It was not happiness exactly, because she had been hurt too recently to trust the word happiness. It was something quieter and more durable than that. It was the slow, strange peace of a person who had stopped waiting for the next hand to come down on her. The brothers in their turn began to teach her things. Amos was the first to start. On a quiet afternoon in the second week of January, he came into the front room with a small block of soft pine in one hand and his short bone-handled carving knife in the other. "I would like to teach you, miss," he said. "If you have a mind to learn, it is a thing for the long evenings when the work is done. I have never carved anything in my life, Mr. Holloway." "Amos, please, just Amos." He smiled a small, soft smile that was his way of smiling. "You do not carve a bird out of a piece of pine. You find the bird that was already inside the piece of pine, and you take away the parts that were hiding it." For 3 nights she worked on the small block of pine in the firelight after supper. On the third night she held up to the lamp a small, clumsy carving of a sparrow with one wing slightly larger than the other, and a blunt little beak that did not quite point the right way. And she said to Amos, with her cheeks coloring, "I am sorry. I am afraid I have wasted your good wood." Amos took the small wooden bird from her hand. He turned it over slowly in his fingers. He studied it for a long time in the firelight, the way a man studies a thing he has been waiting in all his life to see. Then he put the little carved sparrow into the inside pocket of his flannel shirt against his heart, and he looked at her, and he said in a voice so soft she almost missed it, "Miss Ruth, this is the finest thing I have ever been given." He kept that small wooden sparrow for the rest of his life. Silas was the next to teach her. 2 days after the first carving lesson, he came in from the woodshed and he laid an old single-shot Winchester across the kitchen table. And he said, "Miss Ruth, in this country, a woman who cannot put a bullet where she means to put it is a woman waiting for trouble to find her." He took her out behind the cabin in the cold, dry afternoon. The first 12 shots she fired all sailed over the cans and into the snowbank beyond the corral. The 13th shot rang against a tin can with a clear, bright sound that carried halfway up the mountain, and the can leaped into the air and landed in the snow, and Silas Holloway let out a whoop of pure joy and grabbed Ruth around the shoulder and lifted her clean off her feet and turned her in a half circle in the snow. He set her down at once. He stepped back so fast he nearly fell. "Forgive me, miss. I am sorry. I forgot myself." Ruth was laughing. Her cheeks were pink from the cold and the rifle and the surprise. "Mr. Silas, please do not be sorry. You have given me the first present I have had in a very long time." "Silas, just Silas, ma'am," he said quietly, looking down at the snow. "We do not stand much on ceremony in this house, and it is what my mother called me." "Then Silas," she said. He looked up at her, and his whiskey-colored eyes were very bright. He turned away and pretended to have something in his eye, and he busied himself with setting up the cans again. Elias was the last to teach her, and what he taught her was the country itself. He came into the front room one evening after supper with an old folded square of yellowed paper, and he spread it carefully on the long pine table, and he weighted the corners with 4 river stones from the mantel. "Father drew this in '57, Elias said. "The first summer he and Mother wintered through. This is everything we own." He looked up at her. "Would you like me to show it to you, Miss Ellery?" "Yes," she said. "I would like that very much." She came around the table and stood beside him. He bent over the map and his big calloused finger moved across the brown lines. He showed her the cabin, he showed her the spring behind it, he showed her Bitterroot Creek and the lower meadow, and the timber and the high pasture, and here up at the western edge, this little square. This is where Mother and Father are buried. There is a place there where the rock comes out of the ground in a flat shelf, and you can see the whole valley below, and the sun lays down on it last in the evenings. Father picked it himself the summer before he died. Ruth had bent low over the map to follow his finger. As Elias finished speaking, his finger came to rest beside the small square that marked his parents' graves, and Ruth's finger had come to rest there too, and the side of her smallest finger brushed the side of his. Neither of them moved. For 1 breath, 2 breaths, 3, the hand of Elias Holloway and the hand of Ruth Ellery rested side by side on a hand-drawn map of a mountain in the territory of Montana, and neither of them looked up from the paper, and neither of them spoke. Then Elias drew his hand back, slowly, the way a man pulls his hand back from a fire he is not ready to be warmed by. "Well," he said in a voice that was rougher than he had meant it to be, "now you know the country." "Yes," she said softly. "Now I know." She slept very poorly that night. The first week of February brought a stretch of clear, bitter cold weather, and on the second night of that cold spell, Ruth went out to the woodshed for an armload of split pine. She was halfway to the woodshed when she heard the voices. The 3 brothers were standing on the far side of the woodshed. They did not know that Ruth had come outside. The cold air carried their voices clearly to her, and Ruth stood very still in the snow, with her arms around her empty firewood basket, and listened. Brother Silas was saying, "I am going to tell you something I have not said out loud yet. She is not just a guest in this house anymore. She has not been a guest in this house for a long time. She is family now. She is a more than family. I do not know what the word for it is. I only know that every time she smiles in the morning, when I come in for coffee, the sun comes up inside of my chest the way it used to come up over our mother's kitchen when we were boys." There was a long quiet. Then Amos spoke. "You are not the only one, Silas. I am afraid I am falling in love with her. I think I am already there. I do not know what to do about it." Then the deep voice of Elias came from the other side of the woodshed. "I know what you both are feeling. I have felt it longer than either one of you. I have felt it since the moment I picked her up off that platform. I am the man who made you both swear an oath in front of the hearth on the first night she was in this house, and that oath stands. We do not speak a word of feeling to her until she is well enough and free enough to refuse it. We do not push. We do not crowd. She is not a thing to be won. She is a soul, brothers, a precious soul. And whatever she chooses when the time comes for her to choose, she chooses freely, or it is not worth choosing. I hear you said Amos. I hear you said Silas. And brother, if she does not choose me, if she chooses one of you, I want to know now whether I am man enough to stand at the wedding and hold the ring. You will be man enough, Silas. We will all three be man enough, because she is worth being man enough for. We were born brothers first. We will die brothers first. Whatever happens between any one of us and Ruth Ellery, we are brothers first. Swear it again. I swear it, said Amos. I swear it, said Silas. On mother, on father, on the cabin. I swear it. Ruth stood in the snow with the empty basket pressed against her stomach and the tears running freely down her cold cheeks. She had never in her life been spoken about that way by men. This was three men alone in the cold with no audience and no prophet and no reason to lie, deciding in front of God and each other to lay down their wanting for the sake of her freedom. She walked back to the cabin on legs she could barely feel. The second night of the great cold spell, a calf was born early in the lower pasture and got separated from its mother in a drift of fresh snow. Elias rode out alone to find it just before sundown. He told his brothers to stay at the cabin because two men were not needed for one calf. Within an hour, the snow had turned into another full storm, and within 2 hours, Elias Holloway had not come back. Silas paced the front room. After the third hour, Silas stopped speaking. After the fourth hour, he picked up his coat from its peg by the door, and he said quietly to Amos, I am going after him. You are not, said Amos. You went down with the lung sickness in November, brother. You stay here. I will go. You will not go, said Silas. You took an arrowhead in your right thigh from that bull's elk in October. I will go. They were both reaching for their coats at the same time when Ruth stood up from her chair by the fire and said, Neither of you is going. They turned and looked at her. Listen to me, she said. The two of you are arguing about which one is well enough to die out there tonight. Neither of you is well enough. If one of you goes out and does not come back, then there is no one in this cabin to go after him. You stay here, both of you. I am going. You are not, said Silas at once. I am, said Ruth. I will take Cinder, who knows me now. I will take a lantern and a length of rope and one of your coats. I am not asking either of you, I'm telling you. The man who carried me up off that platform in Silver Creek is out in the dark tonight, and I am not going to sit by this fire while the two of you fight over which one of you gets to die instead of him. He came for me. I am going for him. Neither brother moved for a long second. Then Silas very slowly took his own heavy coat down from its peg, and he held it open for her. The coat was much too big for her, but she shrugged into it, and Silas buttoned it up to her throat with hands that were unsteady. Amos went to the corner and took down the second lantern and put a small flask of whiskey into her coat pocket. For him, he said, not for you. When you find him, you make him drink it. I will, she said. Silas walked her out to the barn. He saddled Cinder for her himself. He lifted her up into the saddle. He held the bridle for 1 second longer than he needed to. Ruth, yes, Silas, you bring my brother home. I will, she said. I promise you, I will bring him home. She rode out into the storm. She found Elias half a mile down the lower pasture trail on his knees in the snow, beside a small dark shape that was barely moving. He had his bare hands buried inside the body cavity of the calf where the cord had wrapped, and his blood and the calf's blood were both freezing on the snow around him. The calf was alive, but only just. Elias heard the bell of Cinder's bridle and looked up in his face when he saw who was riding toward him. Through the storm went through 3 changes in 1 second. Recognition, fury, and then something else, something he did not have a name for. Ruth, you turn that horse around. You will die out here. I will not die out here, she said, swinging down from the saddle and setting the lantern in the snow beside him. You will die out here. I'm here to keep that from happening. Tell me what to do. He stared at her for 1 long second. Then his mountain man's mind took over. Hold the lantern up. Hand me the rope from your saddle. We have got about 3 more minutes before this calf is gone, and about 10 more minutes before my hands stop working. She did exactly what he told her. 2 minutes later, the cord came free, and the calf gave a small, ragged kick in a thin, high cry, and the mother cow came forward and began at once to lick her newborn clean. He could not stand up. Ruth took the small flask from her coat pocket and pressed it to his cracked lips. Drink, all of it. He drank it. She helped him to his feet, his arms slung across her small shoulders, and somehow she got him onto Cinder's saddle in front of her, and she swung up behind him and wrapped her arms around his waist inside the bearskin coat, and she turned the mare's head back up the trail toward the cabin. The wind was in their faces now. It took them more than an hour to ride the half-mile back. Elias slumped forward in the saddle most of the way, and Ruth held him there with both arms wrapped tight around his ribs and her cheek pressed against the cold leather of his coat, and she talked to him the whole way. At the cabin, Silas and Amos were standing on the porch with both lanterns lit, and when they saw Cinder come up out of the storm with two figures on her back, they came down the steps at a run. Together, the three of them got Elias inside and onto the bear rug in front of the hearth, and Ruth set herself at once to the work of his hands, the way the brothers had set themselves to the work of her feet 6 weeks before. She brought the basin. She mixed the water with snow until it was barely warm. She took those big, calloused, frozen hands into her own small hands. He began to come back to himself after about half an hour. The pain reached him, then the same pain she had borne on this same rug. Ruth bent her face low over his hands, and her honey blonde hair fell forward and brushed his wrists, and she said softly, "I know it burns, Mr. Holloway. You told me that yourself on this same rug 6 weeks ago. Do you remember?" His eyes were closed against the pain, but the corner of his mouth moved. "I remember," he whispered. When at last the worst of it was past, Elias looked across the bear rug at the woman kneeling beside him in the firelight. Her cheeks were still flushed from the long ride. Her blue eyes were tired and quiet, and he saw now completely unafraid of him. "Ruth," he said. "Yes, Mr. Holloway. Why did you come?" She did not look away from him. "Because you came for me," she said. "On a platform in Silver Creek in a storm worse than this one. You did not know my name. You did not owe me anything. You came anyway. I am not the kind of woman who lets a debt like that go unpaid." He looked at her for a long time. Then very slowly the man of granite, who had not let a tear leave his eyes since the spring of 1874, lowered his head until his forehead came to rest against her forehead. He did not kiss her. He did not put his arms around her. He simply rested his forehead against hers in the firelight on the bear rug, where she had once nearly died, and Ruth Ellery closed her eyes and let him. In the doorway behind them, Silas and Amos stood very still and did not say a word, and they understood, without speaking, what they were looking at. The oath made on the first night Ruth Ellery had spent in their cabin was still being kept, but the slow, inward, unspoken choosing had begun. The winter that had locked the Holloway cabin to the rest of the world for 9 weeks finally broke in the second week of March. The thaw came slow at first, and then all at once. The trail down the mountain, which had been impassable since Christmas, opened enough for a single rider to pass. Elias rode down to Silver Creek alone on the first dry morning. He took a list of supplies from Ruth and a small folded square of paper from Silas with the names of 2 cartridges he wanted, and he told them all he would be back before dark of the second day. He was back before dark of the second day. But the look on his face when he came up the trail told Ruth, standing on the porch with her honey blonde hair tied back and her hands wrapped in her apron, that he had not brought home what he had ridden down for. He swung off Brutus heavily. He took off his hat. He looked at Ruth, and then he looked past her at his brothers in the doorway behind her. "We need to all 4 of us sit down at the table. There is news." They sat. Elias laid a folded sheaf of papers down on the wood between them. "Blackwell has called in every note we owe," Elias said. "Every one. He bought up the small ones from the feed store and the smith and the saddler over the winter. He has put them all under one paper now. The total comes to $4,200. He wants it inside 30 days. If we do not pay, we lose the cabin. We lose the lower meadow. We lose the timber. We lose father's grave. Silas closed his eyes. Amos's hand went very still on the table. There is more, Elias said. He has been to the new judge in Helena, a man named Hayes. Blackwell has filed a complaint against the three of us, claiming we are holding Miss Ellery against her will. The judge is coming on the morning stage day after tomorrow. Ruth was the first to speak. Her voice was very quiet. Then we will go down and meet the judge ourselves, she said. All four of us. I will tell him in front of the whole town what happened on that platform in December. I am not afraid of that man anymore. Elias looked at her for a long second. Then he reached across the table and laid his big calloused hand over her small one and squeezed it once. They came down off the mountain at sunrise on the morning of the third day. Ruth rode behind Elias on Brutus, her arms around his ribs. Silas rode beside them on Cinder, with the sheaf of debt papers buttoned inside his vest. Amos brought up the rear on Pilgrim, his Sunday coat brushed and his hair tied back the small wooden sparrow Ruth had carved still over his heart in his shirt pocket. They came into Silver Creek just before 9 in the morning. The town was already awake. The boardwalks of Main Street were lined with people. Mrs. Pritchard from the boarding house, the old man from the livery stable with his hat in his hand, the Reverend Whitaker standing very straight and very pale in front of his church. And in front of the dry goods store, holding tight to her mother's hand, was a small girl in a brown coat with freckles across the bridge of her nose. Lily Hanson saw Ruth ride into Silver Creek on the front of a black gelding with 3 Holloway brothers around her, and Lily Hanson's small face split open into a smile so bright it seemed to light up the boardwalk. The morning stage from Helena pulled into the depot at 9:15. A spare, clean-shaven man in a black coat stepped down. He was perhaps 50 years old, with the kind of face that did not give anything away, and the eyes of a man who had spent his working life listening to people lie to him. Judge Hayes set his leather case on the platform, looked once at the small crowd that had gathered and walked to the wooden steps of the Silver Creek Trust Bank, where Horace Blackwell was already standing with Sheriff Briggs at his elbow and 4 hired men behind him. Blackwell did not waste time. He pointed his fat finger at Elias as the brothers and Ruth dismounted in the snow. There they are, Your Honor. There is the kidnapper. There is the woman they have been holding all winter on that mountain. Judge Hayes raised one hand. His voice was dry and even. Mr. Blackwell, this is not a courtroom, and I have not asked you to make a statement. He turned his head and looked at Ruth. Young woman, step forward, please. Ruth stepped forward. She did not look at Blackwell. She looked at Judge Hayes. Her hands were folded quietly at her waist. She did not tremble. My name is Ruth Ellery, Your Honor. I am 22 years old. I am of sound mind, and I am standing here in front of you today by my own free will, and I wish to tell you what happened to me in this town on the afternoon of December the 14th. She spoke. She did not raise her voice. She told the story plainly, the way her mother had taught her to tell the truth with no decoration and no anger. She told about the letter from St. Louis. She told about the train and the platform and the nickel in the snow. She told about how Mr. Horace Blackwell had looked her up and down and called her a half-starved church mouse and turned his back on her. She told about the church door that did not open. She told about the boarding house door that did not open. She told about a little girl named Lily Hanson who had come out of nowhere with a piece of warm bread. She told about sitting down against the depot wall to die. And she told about 3 men who had come down off a mountain that they had no reason to come down off and had picked her up out of the snow when no one else in this town had been willing to. If there is a kidnapper in this story, Your Honor, said Ruth Ellery quietly, it is the man who stole my future from me on a public platform with a nickel and a sneer. The Holloway brothers did not take me. The Holloway brothers gave me back to myself. The platform was very quiet. Judge Hayes turned his head and looked at Horace Blackwell. Mr. Blackwell, have you any witness who will swear to a different account of what happened on that platform on December the 14th? Blackwell opened his mouth and closed it. He turned to the men behind him, and none of them met his eye. Mrs. Pritchard from the boarding house took one step forward out of the crowd, and her face was the color of old paper. "I am ashamed, Your Honor. I will swear to it. I had 3 children inside my house, and I let a girl die on my doorstep because Horace Blackwell told me to. I will swear it on a Bible if you put one in front of me right now." The cobbler stepped forward. The blacksmith stepped forward with Lily Hanson clinging to his sleeve. The old man from the livery stepped forward with his hat in his hand and tears running down the long lines of his cheeks. One by one, the people of Silver Creek who had refused Ruth Ellery on a winter afternoon stepped forward into the morning sun and confessed it, and Horace Blackwell stood at the top of the bank steps and watched the wall of fear he had built around this town for 9 years come down brick by brick at his feet. Then Blackwell did the thing that desperate men do when their first weapon fails them. He reached for his second. "Your Honor," he said, "whatever you may think of the matter of the woman, I have a separate matter to bring before you. I hold the notes on every piece of land the Holloway brothers own in the total amount of $4,200, and those notes come due in 27 days. If they cannot pay by the law of this territory, their land becomes mine." He pulled the bound sheaf of papers from inside his coat and held them up. Judge Hayes looked at the papers. He looked at Blackwell. He looked at Elias Holloway. "Mr. Holloway, the matter of the false complaint against you for kidnapping is dismissed before this gathering with my apologies for the trouble of your ride down. The matter of the notes, however, is a matter of contract law. If those notes are in order, you have 27 days. "I am sorry," Elias inclined his head a quarter of an inch. "I understand, Your Honor." The four of them rode out of Silver Creek in the early afternoon. Halfway up the mountain trail, Silas finally spoke. "Brother, we do not have $4,200. We could sell every cow on the place and not raise 3. "I know," said Elias. "What are we going to do?" "I do not know," said Elias, "but we are not selling Father's land to that man, not for any price and not under any law." Ruth, riding behind Elias on Brutus with her arms around his ribs, said nothing, but she had begun very quietly to think. That night after supper, when the brothers had gone to their rooms, and the front room of the cabin was dark, except for the low red glow of the banked hearth, Ruth slipped out of her own bed and lit a single candle, and she opened the small carpet bag that had come with her on the train from St. Louis and that had sat untouched in the corner of her room since the night the brothers had carried her up the mountain. She had not opened it in 3 months. She did not know why she opened it now, except that her mother had always said the Lord puts an answer in your hand a long time before you know to look at it, and you only have to remember to open the right drawer. Inside the carpet bag, beneath her mother's small leather Bible and her grandmother's cameo brooch on its silver chain, there was a folded envelope. The envelope was sealed with red wax. On the outside of it, in a careful, old-fashioned hand, was written, "For Ruth Ellery to be opened only when she has nowhere else to turn, from a friend who has been waiting a long time." Ruth's hands began to tremble. She remembered all at once the elderly woman in the small office above the tobacconist's on Pine Street in St. Louis, the broker named Margaret Crandall, who had asked her almost no questions and charged her almost nothing, and who at the door of the office on the morning Ruth had left for Montana had pressed this envelope into her hand. Ruth broke the red wax seal. Inside the envelope, there was a single folded sheet of paper covered on both sides in the same careful old-fashioned hand. She held the candle close. She read, "My dear Ruth, if you are reading this, then the world has not been kind to you, and I am sorry. My name is not Margaret Crandall. My name is Margaret Ellery. I am the older sister of your father, Samuel. I am your aunt. I have been looking for you since the summer of 1874, when I learned that my brother and his wife had died in the cholera and that their child had been placed in a charity home in St. Louis. The home told me there was no record of any such child. They lied to me. It took me almost 9 years and 2 private detectives to find out where you had gone, which was into the house of the Whitcomb family as a governess. By the time I found you, you were a young woman of your own, and I was afraid you would not believe a stranger who claimed to be your blood. I waited for the Lord to give me an opening. The Lord gave me one in the autumn of this year when you came up the stairs to my office on Pine Street looking for a way out of St. Louis. And I knew you the moment I saw your face because you have your mother's mouth and your father's eyes. Ruth Child, your father and your mother left a small inheritance for you. It has been sitting in the First National Bank of St. Louis since the year of their death, drawing modest interest, waiting for you to be old enough to claim it. The total now stands at $7,500. The bank will release it to you upon presentation of this letter and proof of your identity, which my own affidavit on file with the bank will confirm. The money is yours. It has always been yours. It is the last gift your father and mother were able to give you. If the Lord has been kind, you will not need this letter. If the Lord has been less kind, you will need it. Either way, know this. You have an aunt in St. Louis who has loved you from a distance for 9 years and who would very much like to meet you face to face before she goes to join your father in the long sleep. Your Aunt Margaret Ellery. Ruth read the letter twice. Then she put her face down on the small pine table where the candle was burning, and she wept the way she had not wept since the day she had buried her father and her mother 9 years before. She showed the letter to the three brothers at breakfast. Elias read it twice. He set it down. He looked at Ruth across the long pine table for a long, quiet moment. Then he said, Ruth, that money is yours. Not $1 of it is going to pay a debt of mine. That money is the last thing your father and your mother were ever able to give you in this world. I will lose this cabin before I take it, Mr. Holloway said Ruth quietly. I understand you perfectly. And now you are going to listen to me. On the night of December the 14th, I had nothing in this world. You and your brothers picked me up out of the snow, and you carried me into this house, and you gave me back the only thing I had ever owned, which was the dignity my mother taught me to build inside myself. Now, I am asking you to let me give back something that can be measured in dollars because the thing you gave me cannot be measured in dollars. And the only way I know to honor it is to give what I have. If you refuse me, Mr. Holloway, you will not be honoring my pride. You will be wounding it. Please do not wound it. Elias looked at her for a long second. Then he turned his face toward the window, and his throat moved once, and he said in a voice that was not quite steady, All right, Miss Ellery, all right. It was decided that Silas would go to St. Louis with her. Silas could shoot, and Silas could read a stranger's face, and Silas would not let any harm come to her on that long journey. Elias and Amos would stay at the cabin and watch the trail because both of them had a feeling that Horace Blackwell was not the kind of man who waited politely for a deadline. They left on the morning of the next day. They took the small back trail down to a flag stop on the railroad 60 miles north of Silver Creek so as not to be seen leaving by anyone in town. Elias stood on the porch as Ruth swung up into the saddle, and he laid his hand once on her wrist where it gripped the reins, and he said only, Come back. She looked down at him from the saddle, and she said only, I will. The journey to St. Louis took 8 days. On the train, in the long quiet hours between the stations, Ruth and Silas Holloway talked the way two people talk when they have all the time in the world. He told her about the day at Five Forks when he had been 16 years old, and about the friend who had died beside him a week later at Appomattox, just hours before the surrender. Samuel Reed, he said, he was 17 years old, from a farm outside Trenton, New Jersey. I write his mother every Christmas. Ruth told him about her own father and her own mother. They talked about books they had both read, and they talked about the stars over Montana. And on the 5th night, Silas said to her quietly across the dark of the railway carriage, Ruth, I want you to know something. My older brother is a good man. He is the best man I have ever known. I am glad you chose him. I want you to be happy with him for 40 years. I am going to be the best brother-in-law any woman ever had on this earth. Ruth reached across the dark and squeezed his hand once. Silas, she said, I am glad to have you as a brother. I have never had a brother in my life. You have got 2 now, miss, said Silas Holloway, and one of them carves wooden birds. She laughed in the dark, and somewhere ahead of them, the long whistle of the locomotive cried out across the dark prairie, and the train carried them on towards St. Louis. Margaret Ellery met them at the station. She was a small, white-haired woman with the same blue eyes Ruth had seen every day of her childhood in her father's face, and when she saw Ruth step down from the carriage, she put both hands over her mouth and stood very still for a long moment, and then she opened her arms. Ruth walked into them. Aunt Margaret held her niece against her shoulder for a long time without speaking. When at last she drew back, she touched Ruth's cheek with the tips of her fingers, and she said softly, "Child, you are the image of your mother on her wedding day." The bank released the inheritance the next morning, $7,880 with the interest. Ruth took $4,500 for the debt, with $200 more for the journey home and a small reserve. The remaining $3,180 she left in her aunt's keeping. Ruth and Silas stayed 2 nights with Aunt Margaret in the small house on Lafayette Square. On the second evening by the parlor fire, Aunt Margaret took Ruth's hands in hers and asked her one question only. "These 3 brothers, child, are they good men? Are they truly worthy of you?" Ruth thought for a moment before she answered. Then she said, "Aunt Margaret, they are the kind of men the world has nearly forgotten how to make. They keep their word. They do their work with their hands. They love their mother and their God and their land, and they have loved me without ever asking me for one thing in return. Yes, they are worthy. And now that I know who I am, I know that I am worthy of them too." Aunt Margaret kissed her forehead. "Then go home, child, and come back to me in the summer and bring your husband." The telegram from Elias was waiting for them at the desk of the hotel in Cheyenne on the homeward journey. Silas read it first. His face went white, then it went hard. "Ruth," he said, "we need to take a faster train. What has happened?" He read the telegram aloud very quietly. "Attack on cabin night of 15th. 6 men. Repulsed. Amos shot in thigh. Recovering. Curtis taken alive. He has talked. The truth of 74 is known at last. Come home. Bring papers. Hurry." Ruth stared at him. "The truth of 74, she whispered. "Yes," said Silas Holloway, and his whiskey-colored eyes were full of something old and dark and finally still. "The truth of who killed our mother and our father. We have been waiting 9 years for that truth. The next train east left in 3 hours. They were on it." What had happened in the Bitterroot Range while Ruth and Silas were on the eastbound train was this. Horace Blackwell had not waited for the deadline on the notes. On the night of March the 15th, 6 men hired out of Cody, Wyoming, had ridden up the trail toward the Holloway cabin under a moon 4 days short of full, with orders from Blackwell to burn the cabin, kill the brothers, and bring back any deeds or papers they could find. They had not known that Elias Holloway had been preparing for them since the day Ruth had left for St. Louis. Elias had dug a low rifle pit 20 yards above the trail, where it crossed the last open meadow before the cabin, and Amos was lying in that pit with the long Sharps 50 caliber. Elias himself was waiting in the dark timber on the other side of the meadow with a Winchester repeater and the patience of a man who had been waiting 9 years to know who had killed his father. 3 of the 6 fell in the first 60 seconds of the fight. 2 more fell in the second minute, including the man Amos shot from the rifle pit, who was the leader. Amos took a bullet in the thigh in the same exchange, the bullet passing clean through the meat without striking the bone, and he kept firing. The 6th man, the same Curtis whose loud mouth had told the story in the Red Garter Saloon on the night of December the 14th, threw down his rifle and put both hands in the air and screamed that he wanted to live. Elias came out of the dark timber with the Winchester at his shoulder and walked up to Curtis across the bloody snow and looked at him over the sights, and Curtis fell to his knees in the snow and began to talk. He talked because he was afraid of dying, and because he had been carrying for 2 years a secret that was eating his stomach out from the inside. He told Elias that Horace Blackwell had hired the attack tonight to take the Holloway land. But more than that, he told Elias that his own older brother, a man named Jeb Curtis, who had died 2 years ago in a saloon fight in Cheyenne, had been one of the men Horace Blackwell had paid in the spring of 1874 to attack the homesteads of the Bitterroot Valley, and drive the original families off their land so Blackwell could buy it for a song. He told Elias that Blackwell had paid $500 for the attack on the Holloway place specifically. He told Elias that Jeb Curtis had told this to his younger brother on his deathbed in Cheyenne, and that he had written it down in a small leather-bound notebook which was buried under a stone in the floor of a cabin outside Cody. The brother could take Elias to it. The brother only wanted to live. Elias Holloway stood very still in the snow, with the Winchester at his shoulder for a long time. He thought of his father who had bled into the lower meadow on a night in March of 1874. He thought of his mother who had lived 2 more weeks with a bullet in her side and had used those weeks to teach her 3 sons how to forgive. He thought of his mother saying to him on the night before she died, "Elias, my eldest, do not let this hatred eat you. Hatred is a fire that burns the house it lives in." He lowered the Winchester. He did not lower it because Curtis deserved to live. He lowered it because his mother was watching from somewhere and he had promised her. "Tie your hands behind you," he said quietly. "We are going to take you down the mountain alive. You are going to tell every word of what you just told me to a federal judge in Helena. And then you are going to ride down to Cody with us and dig up that notebook. My mother did not raise me to kill a man on his knees." He sent the telegram to Cheyenne the next morning. Ruth and Silas reached the Holloway cabin on the afternoon of the 7th day after they had left St. Louis. Amos was sitting in the wooden chair by the front room hearth, with his right leg propped on a low stool and a clean white bandage wrapped around his thigh and a tin cup of coffee in his hand. When he saw Ruth come through the door, he tried to get up, and Ruth crossed the room in 3 strides and pushed him gently back into the chair and put her arms around his neck and laid her cheek against the top of his head, and she said, "Amos, I am so sorry I left." Amos closed his eyes against her hair and said, "Hush, sister, hush. Winter always ends. You are home now." Elias stood in the doorway behind them. Ruth turned and saw him there. She crossed to him without a word, and Elias Holloway opened his arms for the 2nd time in his adult life, and Ruth Ellery walked into them and held him as tight as her small arms could hold a man who was nearly a foot taller than her. 3 days later, the 4 of them rode down to Silver Creek with Curtis tied to a saddle behind them and the small leather-bound notebook of Jeb Curtis, which they had recovered from the cabin outside Cody, buttoned safely inside Elias's vest. The town of Silver Creek had heard everything by the time they arrived. The boardwalks of Main Street were lined with people again. Only this time the people were not silent. They were cheering. Mrs. Pritchard was at the front of the crowd with both hands pressed against her mouth, and the cobbler stood beside her, and Lily Hanson was sitting on her father's shoulders waving a small blue handkerchief in the spring sunshine. Judge Hayes was waiting on the steps of the bank. So was Sheriff Briggs, who had finally chosen the side of the Angels because the Angels had brought a notebook. Elias walked into the bank and laid $4,500 in clean banknotes on the desk in front of Horace Blackwell 22 days before the deadline. He counted them out loud one by one. Then he laid the small leather-bound notebook on top of the money. "Mr. Blackwell," said Elias Holloway, "in the spring of 1874, you paid $500 to a man named Jeb Curtis to murder my father and my mother in their own house so that you could buy this land cheap. I have his confession written in his own hand in this book. I have his brother outside ready to swear to it under oath. By the law of this territory, I could shoot you across this desk right now, and no jury in Montana would convict me. But I am not going to shoot you. My mother did not raise me for that. I am going to give you to the law. Stand up. You are going to walk out of this bank in front of the people you have been frightening for 9 years." Blackwell did not stand up. Blackwell reached for the pistol in his desk drawer instead. But Silas Holloway, who had been standing 2 paces behind his older brother, with one hand resting easy on the butt of his Colt, was faster than Blackwell had any right to expect. Silas drew and fired in one clean motion. The bullet took Blackwell through the right wrist, knocked the pistol out of his hand, and knocked Horace Blackwell himself out of his chair and onto the polished wooden floor of his own bank. Sheriff Briggs was on him before he could rise. The trial was held in Helena 6 weeks later. Curtis testified. The notebook of Jeb Curtis was entered into evidence. 5 families from the Bitterroot Valley families, whose fathers and brothers had been killed in the spring of '74, came forward and testified to what Blackwell had done to their homesteads. Horace Blackwell was convicted of murder and conspiracy to commit murder. He was hanged in the prison yard in Helena on the morning of June the 20th, 1884. His estate was seized and broken up. The Holloway brothers were given back the 200 acres of bottomland that Blackwell had taken from their father after the killings of '74. The other families of the valley were given back or paid for what had been taken from them. Silver Creek slowly began to remember how to be a town that was not afraid of itself. On the morning of June the 21st, the day after the hanging, Elias Holloway saddled Brutus and asked Ruth Ellery if she would care to ride with him up to the high place on the western edge of their land, where the rock came out of the ground in a flat shelf and the sun lay down last in the evenings, and where his father and his mother were buried side by side under a single low stone. She rode up the mountain with him in the bright June sunshine. The wildflowers were out, and the timber smelled of warm pitch, and the snow was finally gone from everywhere except the very high passes. They tied the horses below the rock shelf and walked up together. Elias took her hand to help her over the last steep step, and he did not let go of her hand at the top. They stood together on the flat shelf of rock and looked out across the whole Bitterroot Valley spread out below them. They could see the cabin from up there. They could see the lower meadow with the new calves running in it. They could see all the way down to the white roofs of Silver Creek in the far distance. "This is the place I told you about," said Elias. "This is where my father proposed to my mother in the summer of 1846. He brought her up here on her birthday. He had carved her a wooden ring out of a piece of cedar because he could not afford a real one. She kept that ring on a chain around her neck for the rest of her life. We buried it with her." Ruth said nothing. She only watched his face. Elias Holloway turned to her. He took both of her hands in his big calloused ones. He went down slowly onto one knee on the flat rock, with the whole valley spread out below him and the sun on the side of his face, and he looked up at the woman who had been carried into his cabin in a bearskin coat in the December snow. "Ruth Ellery," he said. His voice was low and steady, but his hands were trembling. "I am not a man for speeches. I have a piece of land, and I have 2 brothers who would die for me, and I have a heart that did not beat right for 9 years until you came. The cabin was cold before you walked into it. I was cold before you walked into me. I do not have much else to offer. I have a ring. It was my mother's. I have been carrying it in my vest pocket since the morning you left for St. Louis, because I knew on that morning what I wanted, and I did not have the courage to say so until today." He took the ring out of his vest pocket. It was a thin band of silver with a single small turquoise set into it. "Ruth," he said, "will you marry me? Will you stay on this mountain with me until the Lord calls one of us home? Will you let me try with whatever years I have left to be the kind of husband your mother in heaven would have wanted for her daughter?" Ruth Ellery knelt down on the warm rock in front of him so that her face was level with his face, and she took his rough, weathered cheeks between her 2 small hands, and she said softly, "Yes, Elias, yes. I have been yours since the morning I dreamed of my mother in the snow and woke up under your bearskin coat. Yes, 1,000 times. Yes, for as many years as the Lord gives us, and yes, after that too." He slid the small silver ring onto her finger. It fit. Then he leaned forward and kissed her once gently on the mouth in the bright June sunshine on the rock shelf where his mother and his father were sleeping under the wildflowers. It was Ruth Ellery's first kiss in 22 years on this earth, and it was Elias Holloway's first kiss in 9 years. And the wind that came up the slope from the lower meadow carried the smell of wild lupine and warm pine. And the whole valley below them seemed to hold its breath for a moment and then to let it out very slowly like a thing finally at peace. They were married on the 15th of August, 1884, In a clearing of wildflowers behind the Holloway cabin by a new young preacher named Aaron Bennett, who had come up from Ohio to take the place of the disgraced Reverend Whitaker. Aunt Margaret Ellery had come all the way from St. Louis on the train and the stage to give her niece away. Lily Hanson, who was 9 years old now and almost too tall for the dress she had picked out, walked in front of Ruth, scattering wild daisy petals from a small basket. Silas Holloway stood at his older brother's right hand as the best man, and he held the small silver ring without his hand shaking once, because he had decided long before the wedding day that he would be man enough, and a Holloway man keeps his word. Amos Holloway played his father's old fiddle. He played the slow tune of Shenandoah, the way his mother had sung it over the washtub on summer mornings. And Elias Holloway, the man of granite who had not let a tear leave his eye since the spring of '74, let one tear fall onto the shoulder of his bride's white dress and did not try to hide it. The whole town of Silver Creek came up the mountain that day. Mrs. Pritchard brought 4 pies. The cobbler brought a barrel of cider. The blacksmith brought a horseshoe nailed to a length of pine board to hang over the cabin door. The old man from the livery stable brought nothing but his hat in his hand and the request that Ruth Holloway would forgive him the matter of one cold December afternoon. And Ruth Holloway took both of his hands in hers and said, "There is nothing to forgive any longer, sir. The winter is over. We are all of us forgiven." That night, when the last guest had ridden down the mountain trail and the lamps in the front room of the cabin had been blown out one by one, Elias Holloway carried his bride across the threshold of the small bedroom that had once been his mother's, and the door closed gently behind them, and the soft yellow light of the lamp on the bedside table burned on for a little while longer, and then it too was put out, and only the low red glow of the banked fire in the front room remained on the floorboards of the Holloway cabin. Outside, a clear half moon was rising over the dark shoulder of the Bitterroot Range, and the wildflowers in the meadow below the cabin nodded once in a small, warm wind. And somewhere in the timber above the cabin, a single owl called twice and was answered by another. And the long night of the long winter that had begun on a platform in Silver Creek in December was finally and completely and forever over. 29 years later, on a warm September afternoon in the year 1913, Ruth Holloway sat in a wooden rocking chair on the wide front porch of the Holloway cabin and watched 3 of her grandchildren chase each other through the cosmos flowers in the lower yard. She was 52 years old. There was silver in the honey blonde hair at her temples now. Her eyes were still the color of cornflowers. She wore a soft gray wool dress and a white shawl her Aunt Margaret had knitted for her in the last winter of Aunt Margaret's life 14 years ago. Beside her in the second rocking chair, a chair he had carved for her with his own hands. The spring after their first anniversary sat Elias Holloway. He was 64 years old. His chestnut brown hair had gone almost white, and his shoulders were a little stooped now from the long years of mountain work. But he still rode out to the lower pasture every morning, and his amber eyes when he looked at the woman sitting beside him on the porch were the same amber eyes that had lifted her up off a wooden platform in a December snowstorm 29 years and 9 months before. Their 5 children were grown. Sarah Prudence Holloway, the eldest, was 28 years old, married to a doctor in Bozeman with 2 small daughters of her own. Thomas Samuel was 26 and ran the lower pasture with his father. Margaret Lily, named for both of Ruth's beloved aunts, was 23 and taught school in Silver Creek the way her grandmother Prudence had once taught school behind a Methodist church on Olive Street in St. Louis. Amos Elias was 20 and away at the university in Missoula reading law. Grace Eleanor, the baby, was 18 and newly engaged. Silas Holloway had married a school teacher named Hannah Marsh from Bozeman in 1886. They had 4 children of their own and lived in a smaller cabin half a mile down the trail. Silas was 64 now too, and his cough from the old lung sickness still came back to him in the cold months, but he was happy. Amos Holloway, the youngest brother, had finally married late at the age of 40 to a kind, quiet widow named Elizabeth, who had brought 2 small children with her, and Amos had loved those 2 children as if they were his own blood. Amos was 58 now, and he still carved wooden birds in the long winter evenings, and he still played his father's old fiddle on Sunday mornings in the small, clumsy carving of a sparrow that Ruth Ellery had made for him in the firelight of January 1884, was still in the breast pocket of his Sunday coat, worn smooth as riverstone by half a century of his thumb passing over it. Aunt Margaret Ellery had died peacefully in her sleep in the small house on Lafayette Square in St. Louis in 1899 at the age of 76. Per her written wish, her body had been brought west on the train, and she had been buried on the High Rock Shelf at the western edge of the Holloway land beside Thomas Holloway and Sarah Holloway, where the sun lay down last in the evenings. Ruth reached out across the small space between the two rocking chairs and laid her hand on Elias's hand. His hand was thinner now than it had once been, and the old white scar on the back of it had faded, but the calluses were still there. Elias, she said quietly, do you remember? He did not need to ask remember what. He smiled the slow, deep smile that only she had ever seen in 29 years of marriage. I remember every day, my love, he said. I remember a small, cold thing wrapped in my father's bearskin coat. I remember how light you were in my arms. I remember thinking on the ride up the mountain that if the Lord let her live, I would build my life around her for as many years as he gave me. He has given me a great many years, Ruth. He has given me more than I knew how to ask for. She laid her head against his shoulder the way she had laid it 10,000 times in 29 years. Below them in the lower yard, their little granddaughter, Prudence Sarah's youngest, who was 4 years old and had honey blonde hair and blue eyes, came running across the cosmos, flowers calling for her grandmother, and Ruth Holloway lifted her arms to receive the child into her lap. 29 years before Ruth Ellery had stepped down from a westbound train onto a wooden platform in the town of Silver Creek, with nothing in this world but a worn carpet bag and a folded letter, and the dignity her mother had taught her to build inside herself brick by brick. A man named Horace Blackwell had looked at her and called her a half-starved church mouse and thrown her into the snow. He had not known that man in his black wool coat and his tall city hat, that he was not the one writing the story of Ruth Ellery's life that day. He had not known that on a mountain 18 miles to the west, three brothers who had never seen her face were already saddling their horses to ride down for salt and sugar and ammunition, and that one of those three brothers would carry her up off the platform an hour and a half later, and that the cold he had meant to kill her with would instead be the doorway through which she would walk into the only true home she had ever known. That is the kind of thing the world does not understand about the men who used to live on the high frontier, my friends. The world has forgotten the kind of men they were. They were men who kept their word. They were men who worked with their hands. They were men who loved their mothers and their gut and their land. And when they found the right woman, they loved her with every quiet thing they had for 40 years, and they were buried beside her on the rock shelf where the sun lay down last in the evenings. The little granddaughter in Ruth Holloway's lap put her small hand up against her grandmother's cheek and said, "Grandma, why are you crying?" Ruth smiled at her through the wet shine in her cornflower blue eyes. "I am not crying, sweetheart," she said. "I am just remembering. I am remembering the day my real life began. It was a very cold day, but the men who came for me were warm enough for 2 whole lives, and I have been warm ever since." She held the child against her shoulder. Beside her, Elias Holloway closed his amber eyes in the warm September sun, and the Bitterroot Range rose blue and quiet behind them in the long afternoon light. And the long story that had begun on a December platform in 1883 came at last gently and completely and exactly as it was meant to its end.